Hi, and welcome to LAI 514, Week 10, Argument Writing Part 2, presented by Lindsay and Matt. This week we begin by looking at how judgments are made in the real world. We make simple judgments every day, but more complex judgments require warrants and backing. So what that means is, when we make a judgment, we need to back up our thoughts with evidence. People make judgments all the time without questioning them or thinking them through, and sometimes these judgments are based on prejudice and intolerance. One of the things that we can do as teachers is to teach our students how to think critically about making judgments so that they can make informed decisions and back up their decisions with evidence. An important thing that we can do is to teach our students the importance of setting clear definitions. We need to set clear definitions, and those definitions must be defended. One of the examples I would like to focus on is the question of what is reasonable force. This was shown in Hillocks by the case of Scott versus Harris. In this case, police officer Timothy Scott found Victor Harris, a 19-year-old, speeding. When he tried to pull him over, Harris decided to start a high-speed chase. Police officer Scott determined that it was reasonable for him to ram the back of Harris's car to force him to stop. The courts, when they looked at this case, had to set a clear definition of what reasonable force means. They argued that since Harris was speeding, that he was putting civilians at risk by his excessive speed, and therefore Officer Scott had the correct reasoning to rear-end him and end the speed chase. If reasonable force had not been clearly defined, the courts would not have been able to come to a definite answer about if it was warranted or not in this case. Another thing we can also add to our definitions is the use of criteria. Criteria give a basis for making distinctions in definitions that can often seem very close to each other. The example given by Hillocks is the definition of terrorism versus the definition of an act of war. Both of those things might end with the killing of civilians, but what makes them different? Well, terrorism is a deliberate attempt to harm civilians and instill fear to achieve a political goal. Well, if the definition of terrorism has the criteria in it that it is a deliberate attempt to harm civilians, it's easier to make the distinction between terrorism and an act of war. The example given by Hillocks is of the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. Hillocks argues that this was a terrorist attack because the embassy was a symbol of the U.S. government. The harming of the civilians in the embassy was intentional. On the other hand, Hillocks gives a contrasting example, saying that if civilians were killed by guerrilla fighters in the process of bombing enemy soldiers launching offensive operations, the action could not be labeled as terrorism because the killing of the civilians was accidental rather than intentional. By giving an example of a fulfillment of the criterion and an example that contrasts it, you are able to more clearly make the distinction based on the criteria you supported. So how can we teach our students to make judgments based on criteria? Well, the best way for them to do that is to just try it. The way Hill explains this is through the use of the Giraffe Award. In this fictitious award, the students can award someone who sticks their neck out for the common good. In this case, the teacher presents students with several different cases, and the students read about these people and must decide whether or not the person should be awarded the Giraffe Award. Now, the Giraffe Award is only given to people who meet very specific criteria. It must be someone who takes a significant personal risk, who acts out of caring, who does more than just what their job describes. So, for this award to be given out, students must analyze different cases of different people and make clear definitions of what a risk is. What is a sacrifice? These types of questions can begin class discussions to help students really think critically about what those different criteria means and what it would look like for a person to fulfill them. After a class discussion begins, students can break out into small groups and have small group discussions where they analyze each case and decide if each person should be awarded the Giraffe Award or not. It really gives them a chance to dive deeper in the discussion of the criteria. Another example Hillix gives us is that of Nazi Germany. Through this, he teaches that learned judgments can make us question and examine the backing of warrants. In Nazi Germany, children would have learned what behavior was acceptable and what was not. They would have learned that anyone who was not part of the Aryan race should be removed. But those judgments were not backed up. For this reason, many children joined the line of fighting without even questioning why they were doing it. Another example Hillix gives is that of courage. What is courage? How do we define it? And what makes a person courageous? Determining the definition can be complex and abstract and requires a very unfamiliar way of thinking by students. Students might need to begin their thinking with a teacher-led discussion. A teacher can introduce this topic by using an example that students can relate to. Can Superman be courageous? Since most students have never written criteria before, introducing it with a familiar example can help grab their attention and get them started discussing things as a class. Through the Superman example, the teacher is able to have the students begin making criteria to clearly define what courage means. They decide that Superman could not be courageous because he was not in any danger by trying to protect Lois Lane. The class, after discussing that, is then able to determine other criteria for defining courage, and they can also give examples of what courage would look like and what it does not look like. So why do we need to teach criteria and definitions when teaching argument writing to students? Well, it's essential because students can apply what they have learned in their reading, their writing, and more importantly, in their lives. It fosters more thoughtful reading and interpretation and encourages students to make sound judgments both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So for your first discussion question, I would really like you to think about this. How can you use the teaching of criteria to enhance argumentative writing in your classroom?
Hello, everyone. As we move into Chapter 7 of Hillocks, it deals specifically with inferences. And I know what you all may be thinking. Inferences is a super easy topic to comprehend, but you'd actually be mistaken when it comes to students. Inferring correctly and properly is a learned skill. Who teaches students to learn inferences? Well, it would be us, the educators. It falls to us to give our students the tools to infer well. Students are basically blank tablets. Teachers provide them with the tools necessary to inscribe understanding. Inferring doesn't come naturally. It falls to the teachers to teach their students how to infer well. Now, why is inference so important? Because it leads to student understanding. All teachers hope their students will infer well when exposed to a text, but hopes are baseless without action. As Hillock states, if these are our goals, we can develop curricula that systematically provide students with the knowledge and experience to make these kinds of inferences. Hillocks is also showing that it is a teacher responsibility to teach students to infer. Making inferences requires knowledge. Teachers must provide the knowledge necessary for students to make the most inferences possible, make the most informed inferences possible. As Hillocks also states, if we want to help students become strong inferential readers, we must provide the knowledge, experience, and practice that will allow them to do so. Inferences are a learned task. Again, it falls to teachers. Students will not be able to infer well unless they are given the proper tools. If a student is left to infer without being shown how to do it properly, they will fall to personal experience and base all of their inferences only on what they've seen or experienced and not bring anything outward into it. Therefore, it requires necessary planning of knowledge to teach students how to infer properly. As Hillock states, that there is a main focus on the human aspect of experience. You shouldn't focus on large topics in inference. We need to teach students on a smaller scale that they can build up to a larger scale. Hillocks puts forward that we should focus on human characteristics that will resonate with students. We shouldn't be dealing with ambiguous large topics that need to be structured and broken down into pieces. We should be dealing with love and hate and courage. Students must be able to relate it to their lives and find it interesting. You cannot put forward love as merely romantic love. You have to explore it in all of its capacity. If students don't resonate with the material, they are going to be alienated and not care about the lesson or retain any of the information presented. But the concept also must have concrete instances. If you're dealing with something ambiguous, the students may not be able to conceptualize it and contextualize it within their minds, and they'll struggle to actually comprehend what it means. Therefore, with like love, hate, and courage, you're dealing with characteristics that have actions that represent them. It's easier for students to see and picture. What is also extremely important is bringing in texts that incorporate that concept. If you're dealing with love and hate, bring in Romeo and Juliet. Bring in something that combines the two, shows the students that they can coexist, and gives them concrete examples. The Montagues hate the Capulets. There is absolute hate between the two of them, but there is also a blossoming love between Romeo and Juliet. The two coexist, and also in many forms between characters, between romantic interests, in many capacities. But with that, you cannot cater this lesson fully. The students must be captains of their own learning. Teachers can expose the students to the catered materials, but then must back off in a sense to let the students teach themselves, to develop their understandings themselves after being shown it. There are conceptual learning units. Basically, what we need to do is provide concepts students may already believe they understand and then add new dimensions. This is as I previously stated about love. You can bring in something like Deepak Chopra's 7 stages of love. Show students sides of these characteristics that they never knew existed. And don't just teach about one at a time. Teach about the numerous interactions between the characteristics and how they coexist, just like love and hate in Romeo and Juliet. Now, these concepts cannot be floating in the ether. They need to have literature associated with them to give them meaning. Teachers must actively pair the teaching of concepts with appropriate literature, like I've already stated. If you want to teach love and hate, just bring out Romeo and Juliet. If you want to talk about courage and teach courage, bring out a war narrative, something the students can actually get a sense of what courage is, and maybe not what they think courage is. Students may go into war literature with understanding courage is standing up to something you're scared of. But war paints a very different picture of what it means to be courageous in many different ways. And we need to be challenging our students, broadening their scope, broadening their thought process to increase their ability to infer well. Also, if you want to get a bit more ambiguous, bring in authoritativeness and pair 1984. That would be after you've already exposed students to the more entry level concepts and want to amplify it a bit. Now, a main thing when it comes to teaching inference is the teacher cannot be the central part of it. Students teach students. In discussion, students learn more when they put forward a foundational idea and then build upon it with members of their class. The teacher is, of course, the catalyst of the discussion and brings in the materials, but students learn from one another. Discussions on the text must be guided by the teacher, but led by the students. Students will better learn warrants and backing to interpret character actions and changes in attitude through this manner of learning, a big step of inference. Learning this way will also increase numerous life skills. By being able to infer well and being able to develop their understanding through their own thoughts and actions and voice, students will be able to increase their analytical reasoning skills, their critical thinking. They can analyze text in many different ways, pulling out arguments, weighing validity. Being able to infer well helps students in many facets of life outside of literature, but also within it. We move from Chapter 7 of Hillocks to New York State Writing and Reading Standards. Now, there are writing and reading standards for all major content areas. I am going to be a social studies educator in the future, so I will be focusing on the grades 6 through 12 social studies reading standards, writing and reading standards. There is an overt focus on technology. New York State Common Core standards want all teachers to know we have to incorporate technology. They will not let it go. They will not let you forget. You cannot ramble on in front of an overhead. We need to incorporate technology, and that is hammered over and over through the framework. As they state for grades 6 through 8 in social studies, use technology, including the internet, to produce and publish writing and present the relationships between information and ideas clearly and efficiently. They tweak it just a bit, make it a bit more in depth for the high school ages, and they say for those grades 9 through 12, use technology, including the internet, to produce, publish, and update individual or shared writing products, taking advantage of technology's capacity to link to other information and to display information flexibly and dynamically. We are living in a modern era, yet education has not progressed with society. Education is lagging behind a fully integrated technological society. Students are growing up with technology, yet their access to it is limited in the classroom and in academics as a whole. We need to be getting students ready for the rest of their lives by making them proficient in technology, getting them to submit assignments through it, posting assignments online, communicating with students through online and technology-based forums, bringing technology into the classroom through Chromebooks, iPads, numerous other avenues. And that's what New York State really wants to hammer home through the writing and literacy. Students can read ebooks. Students can write through word processors and numerous other creative ways through Prezi and PowerPoint. They can really make it their own and give themselves a voice through their writing. New York State also put a heavy focus on argumentation. They're finally realizing the importance of argument, just as Hillocks has stated its importance in the classroom. Social studies has also been specifically included in the push for more argumentative writing in the classroom. As New York State framework states for grades 6 through 12, writing arguments focused on discipline-specific content. They want to get these students arguing specifically on historical and social science-rooted issues. They want them to have an argument. They want them to have feelings, an idea, a voice. For the high school grades, they go a bit more in depth. They want students to develop claims and counterclaims fairly, supplying data and evidence for each while pointing out the strengths and limitation of both claims and counterclaims in a discipline-appropriate form. They are really going deep with students developing an argument. They want them researching. They want them deep diving. They want them basing their argument in fact, not feeling. And I think that is a huge part of argumentative writing in the classroom in the future. As we move from the Common Core framework to the Engage New York framework for literacy standards, I will also be focusing on social studies. There are some very large overlaps between the Common Core state standards and the Engage New York standards. Something that differs is that Engage New York is intently focused on literacy in social studies classroom for all grades. They state specifically that they want reading and writing to be embedded directly into social studies classroom instruction. Teachers can no longer just lecture. Teachers can no longer just stand and have their students receive what they are saying. They need to get students engaged through writing activities, through literacy activities. Reading and writing must be central. They also want a major focus on social studies classrooms incorporating much more reading and writing just overall. No longer will literacy needs of all students fall on ELA teachers. It is on all content area teachers to incorporate reading and writing equally. Therefore, students can succeed in all content areas and not falter if they struggle in ELA. The main overlap is in technology and argument. Engage New York hits on the same points in both as the Common Core state standard did. In Engage New York, they want to integrate and evaluate content presented in diverse media and formats, including across multiple texts. It's the same thing as the Common Core state standard. They want students accessing media. They want them going through online mediums, working with, integrating technology, working with it in literacy, reading, and writing. In terms of argument, Engage New York says they want students to write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics of text using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. It's the same thing, although they're bringing it to grades 6 through 12 with the weighing of validity and bringing in sort of research instead of just the high school grades like the Common Core state standards were. An area where Engage New York separates itself is with inference, just like Chapter 7 of Hillocks. Engage New York states specifically in 3 separate quotes that they want students to read closely to determine what the text says explicitly/implicitly and make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. They also want students to determine the central ideas or themes of a text and analyze their development and summarize the key supporting details and ideas. Finally, in terms of inference, they want students to analyze how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of a text. Engage New York is focused on starting with small inferential ideas and boosting it up into huge, full text basis. They want students to understand the minute and any sort of large sweeping topic all at the same time through development of those skills. Engage New York is really helping inference, which in turn helps argumentative writing. That's it. Thank you for listening. Argumentative writing and the state standards on literacy are extremely important to all of us. Some questions that you can answer through your responses are, how can you use the teaching of criteria to enhance argumentative writing in your classroom specifically? And what are some inventive ways to incorporate writing into your classroom while still adhering to the state literacy standards? Can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you, everyone.